Welcome back to another episode of Fika Bytes. This week, we're sitting down with Jana. Now, she's got one of the more unique paths that I've seen to becoming a hardware founder. She started out as a clinician and a researcher, essentially spending a lot of time in academia doing the cutting edge research and trying to push the frontiers of science, and then deciding that she wants to be an entrepreneur. But not just any entrepreneur. She wanted to be an entrepreneur who ships physical products that can impact and help people's lives. So we talked a little bit about her first product, which had a very specific medical application. And then we talked about her second product, which is the Breth device, and it's geared toward a much larger audience. So we talk about the difference in approaching those two types of products. We also talk a lot about how it feels to take all of this research that's being done in academia and finding a market for it in the consumer world. Now, since we recorded this last year, they've been shipping the Breth product, and they're now gearing up for a Kickstarter so they can start working on some new hardware and new software features that they've been brainstorming, getting feedback on. Jana's got a really unique story. There's lots of valuable lessons shared. So without further ado, let's get to it. All right, we're live. I've got Jana here with me. Jana, thank you so much for taking the time to join. I want to talk about your background and how research and clinical experience has led you to engineering and starting a company that has now made two hardware products. So we'll get into all of that. But first, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Biggs. I'm really happy to be here with you and happy to tell you a little bit about my background. Trained as a clinician, so my background training was in speech and language pathology. Did a PhD that was focused on breathing kinematics and the relationship of breath work or breathing and technology and what technology does to us. After I had finished that, I got a position at one of the institutes in the city here, and that position was working as a clinician-scientist with patients who had head and neck cancer. And so it was a fantastic opportunity. This institute that I worked at was really innovative, and one of the things that they believed in strongly was that we always would have biomedical engineering embedded into what we were doing. So, there were implants, like titanium implants, that we were dealing with when we were working with these patients. That's kind of how the whole bioengineering thing started. But it went from there into things like 3D modeling, rapid prototyping, and eventually into the products that we developed as part of True Angle, which is the company that I spun out from the University of Alberta.
Okay, I think that's a great segue point into that moment where you decided to start True Angle. So what was that point where you decided, I want to go into this, I want to start a company, and I want to develop these products that I believe should exist in the market?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I think I always had a little bit of that entrepreneurial blood in me. My dad was an entrepreneur. It was always something we talked about around the dinner table, and so there was always that leaning in terms of that.
Sure.
When I went and did my clinical career, it was kind of interesting because after each degree, I was like, I don't know. I think I should go back and do an MBA. Like there was always this pull, but when I started working at the institute, I think what that did for me was it really allowed, because of the way it was set up, really allowed me to be creative in terms of pushing the boundaries for what we could do within medicine for people who needed solutions. And so what I was able to do was to get a $2 million grant into my lab that allowed us to develop this technology for one of the big problems that we saw with our patients, which was swallowing disorders. And these are like major swallowing disorders. This isn't just like, oh, kind of hurts to swallow. This is like, I can't swallow anything without the fear of choking,
Mm.
or the fear of getting things into my lungs, getting a pneumonia and dying from that. So really serious consequences. But the technology that we had was really humongous. It was like a big cart, a big computer stuck in my lab. And so the information that patients needed from that technology, the biofeedback from it, they weren't able to get, so they weren't able to exercise properly,
Okay.
etc. So having said all that, with this grant that I got, we were able to create this just a small remote technology that fits in your pocket essentially. So our amazing engineers took this humongous thing and made it really small. But I think the moment of thinking about, oh, I need to do something and spin this into a company, well, I wouldn't say it was a moment. It was kind of like this thing I could see coming at us in the future. And as part of the grant that we got, we had to write in a commercialization plan. When I look back on that,
Uh,
it was just really naive. And it was just like, okay, it was maybe a page out of a 30-page grant,
uh,
but there was a promise there that, we would do something in terms of not letting whatever we figured out sit on a shelf in the lab, which I think happens all too often when people are dealing with technologies and research funding like that. So the real driver came when it was time to be renewing provisional patents that we had submitted. And research funding doesn't allow you to do that, right?
oh,
So it was like, okay, I need to come up with money somehow to pay for these patents. And at the time, there were some grants that were available for companies. You had to have a company, you had to have investment in it. And that kind of started the whole thing. And at first, when I was looking at it, having been an academic, I thought, I don't know if I can do this. Like, is
mm,
this something I have the skills for to actually start a company and
mhm,
get going? So I brought someone in to help. And what I realized fairly quickly was that, that I did have the skills to be able to do it.
mm,
And that taking that jump was going to be something that, yeah, I'd have to network and learn from other people, but it was something that I was really excited about. And I think because I always had that in my blood,
mm.
um, even though it was a little bit intimidating and scary, it was like, no, I want to do this. I want to just go full bore, jump both feet into this and do it. It meant that I had to figure out how to do it, essentially.
Yeah. And it sounded like you said you brought someone in that maybe had more experience on the business in the business world. Is that right?
Yeah, and what I found, Vix, was that a lot of what was being brought forward in that case was things that I could actually do and that I
Uh,
wanted to do. And so, there came a point where it was like that isn't necessary. I have the drive, I have the motivation to learn to do this. And so I took it from there essentially.
I think that's a really great trait to have, and why you're such a successful entrepreneur is because even though you were kind of hesitant, you didn't know what you didn't know. Once you start doing it, I think like it kind of starts to snowball. Maybe you do something small first, it builds up your confidence, and then you do something else, and you start to see that it's a matter of just effort and persistence as opposed to a particular clever trick or perspective, right?
100%. I think that's really a great observation about just building up confidence around doing it.
Yeah. I want to talk about the development of your first product, the Mobili-T. Before we talk about the actual process for it, could you just give a brief outline of what are all the system components? Like, I believe there's a wrist worn wearable. Is there anything else? And then how does it help the patient, I guess, in a layman's term so that I can understand it?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So it's a small wireless technology. It's the technology that the core technology inside of it is EMG, so surface electromyography. So basically, we're measuring muscle contraction through it.
Okay.
So it's worn under the chin when patients are doing their exercises for swallowing. So you can kind of think of it like physiotherapy for swallowing. But like other parts of physiotherapy where, you can see my bicep, and if I contract it, I have that visual connection with my body. With the swallowing muscles was really difficult for people to know what they were
Oh,
doing, if they were doing it the right way, as well as adherence to any kind of exercise program. What we knew from the literature was it was around 20%, and that's pretty typical. So but we knew if people did these exercises and if they did them the right way and intensively for, an extended period of time, that they could get over some of these issues that they were experiencing. So yes, there's a wireless device. It sticks under the chin with a thin custom made adhesive. We
okay.
have an app. There's firmware on the device. There's an app that delivers the exercise program to the patient,
Okay.
and there's also a clinician portal. so that clinicians can actually track in real time what the patients are doing. So they can see, are my patients doing their exercises? How many have they done? How
Oh,
many targets have they hit? So as a clinician, this was really awesome because, um, you always had to go on what a patient was telling you in
right.
terms of how much they were doing. And we all can exaggerate how active or not active we are. And we
Yeah.
might even think we're more active. It's only when you get put on a wearable and you're like, wow, I barely move in a day. I'm at my desk for how many hours? Like, it's
Yeah.
eye-opening. And so I
Yeah.
think, basically that's what this first technology was. It gave patients feedback about how their muscles were contracting, if they're doing the exercises right, and then also put that to the clinician.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of grander lesson here that I'm getting, which is a lot of the times the human body, you kind of fall into your patterns, fall into your habits. And the reason these smart wearables are helpful is because they can snap you out of it and they can have the objective view and not your subjective view. I remember when I first got a Fitbit several months ago, I had a notification on it that would like tell me if I didn't move enough per hour. And when I first wore it, that thing was buzzing constantly because I didn't realize, but like I said, you're just sitting at a desk and your brain is occupied, but your body maybe not so much so. And that external factor was a helpful reminder for me. And even more so when patients are doing their rehabilitation exercises, I'm sure.
Absolutely, absolutely, and, if you think about it, I don't know if you're like this, but when I first got a Fitbit, I'm like, "Oh, yeah, 10,000 steps, no problem, I must do that in a day," and then you'd see how very little you did in a day, and you're like, "Oh my god, it takes concerted effort to
Yeah.
get those steps in." And when we first were developing Mobili-T, Fitbit had just come onto the market. And so we're very much like, we want this to be the Fitbit for swallowing, is because we knew that that was part of the issue, that the exercises just weren't being done to the same degree that we wanted. And what our studies showed was that 20% that 20% adherence rate actually, in our studies, we had 78% adherence even at 6 weeks. So it was hugely made a huge difference in the amount of time that patients were spending on their exercises.
Now let's talk about the development of the device, which I believe at this point you didn't have any engineering background or experience. So, what was the internal talk that you had with yourself when you were like, "I got to make this into a product"? It sounded like you had a team of engineers, which is great. But I would love to get kind of your perspective on the start of that process.
Yeah, that's I love this story because it's again one of those things that highlights how important it is in healthcare to have multidisciplinary teams when we're
Mm.
dealing with complex patient populations. So I had started a control trial where I wanted patients to come into my lab to get hooked up to that big machine to get the biofeedback that they needed. And it was so hard to recruit people. And I understand it because it meant coming in and out of the hospital every day, paying for parking, paying for gas,
Mm.
taking time off work. So inconvenient. So I actually had to just cancel the trial.
Oh,
And at the time, I had a young clinician working in my lab and also one of the engineers who is now the co founder with me of True Angle, Dylan Scott. They were having lunch together, and she had said to him, you know, can you help with this problem? Like, isn't there a way that we could make this smaller and more accessible? And that kind of started the whole thing. So we started some pretty ugly benchtop versions of, could this at least be made smaller? And it went from there. We had some industrial design students. We also had connections to industrial design. So we had some of those students come in and work on the form factor of what it could look like. And when things really took off was when I got the funding to actually be able to do this because hardware development isn't cheap. I'm sure you know that. And any kind of product development with hardware in it takes resources. So we were really fortunate that we received that funding from the Cancer Foundation to solve this problem for patients who had cancer. So then once we had the funding in place, that's where things really took off. We had a bunch of different engineers who joined in. We had materials engineers who were working with us because we were thinking, okay, should we be thinking about flexible electronics. And
Uh,
we actually came up and we filed a patent around that and were granted that patent, but we decided not to use that as our form factor for financial reasons, actually, that it didn't make sense in terms of having a product that was with patients. So that's how engineering came into play. And of course, it kind of worked like clinicians having unreal expectations about what they wanted, engineers saying that's impossible, and then everybody sitting around and, jamming on like, how could we make it possible? So some of our early prototypes had things like dangling around the neck. There were wires, like, get rid of the wires. We have to get rid of the wires. So, I'm sure all those things that engineers love, but I think they're great challenges to have. And yeah, we had just such bright minds around the table that we came up with this beautiful product. And then as things went along, I think Dylan would agree that there were certain things that as an engineer he never thought he'd be doing as a co-founder in a business. So now you have a device that has a medical aspect to it. There's all kinds of regulatory, quality management, just a whole bunch of stuff that goes into developing that. It probably wasn't ever in his plan to be doing.
right.
But so
I was going to ask, which is, so this is an actual medical device, and how does that impact marketing it and selling it? I'm not really familiar with the medical world. So are you going to clinicians, to practitioners, or are you kind of educating the patients about the existence of such a device? How exactly does all that work?
that was a real journey that we went on, and I would say that fits into our product market fit journey.
Okay.
And so we were just backing up a bit. When we made the jump into the company, one of the things that we did was we were accepted into the Creative Destruction Lab Accelerator, CDL. Awesome accelerator. And it's a 9-month program, and it's kind of one of these where you have mentors within the program. There's certain goals that you have to hit every 6 weeks. And if you don't, you basically get voted off the island. And so when we got in there, it was a really eye-opening for us because these things that we hadn't thought of in terms of business were being put forward to us. So regulatory and who's your customer, and some of those things that really I think are would have been better had it come in earlier in that academic process. We probably would have thought about things more differently. Anyhow, with the medical product, when we first went to market, and one of the things that we had done as a development team was we wanted to make it product as simple as possible for patients to use. Again, we were thinking of it in terms of like, this is like a Fitbit for swallowing. These patients have been given these exercises. They know what to do. It's just they need something to help them stay on track. So it was made very intuitively for people to use. Now, when we went to market and we went that direct to consumer route as a wellness product, we learned some things. We learned it was easier to find clinicians than patients who had a specific problem like that. And there was still a reliance of patients on clinicians. So it was that because of the seriousness of this condition, it was unlike other conditions where maybe people are more willing to like be like, okay, as long as I monitor this one physiological thing, I'm all right with it. I'm at home and I can tell my doctor if something goes off.
Right.
Was a little different. So we were getting a lot more pull from clinicians. And what we made the decision, okay, we're going to get off the wellness path. We're going to head onto a medical device pathway, because then the other thing you have to think about as a company is, okay, you're going to sell this thing, but what's your value proposition to the people who are going to buy it? And so for us, being registered as a medical device brought some reimbursement potential along with it. So you ask the question, who do we sell to? Really, the clinicians are the ones who have to buy into us. So the ones who are going to be teaching the patients how to use this, giving it to them so they can use it at home, they get it right away. They get it. They love it. They want it. But now they don't hold the money most often. There aren't a lot of private practitioners in our field. So the who tends to hold the money are people higher up in the food chain in the health system, who are either directors of rehab or VPs of medical something or other. So, there's a bunch of different levels of folks that you have to get to be getting to the one that has the money. So, say that that wasn't something we expected, that we would have to be figuring our way through the health system the way we have.
Mhm.
Um, and also just the amount of time that that takes to get to the right person. Sales within health systems aren't necessarily quick and speedy.
And then how did all that manifest into your second product? So Breth Tech, that's kind of your new initiative. I believe it's not publicly available yet, but I want to kind of hear about how you took those mobility lessons and then have applied them to Breth, and maybe start with that full circle moment you were talking about where, you had initially studied breathing and now you get to build a product for that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, it came down to looking at, okay, we're a tech company, we're excited about building products. We have one in the market, we're getting some traction there. How do we build on that success? Like, how do we keep innovating as a company? And we looked at where are our strengths as a company and where are maybe the current needs of our customers. So, one of the things, again, with folks who have swallowing disorders is there's a couple things. First, it's a very anxiety provoking thing to
Mhm.
have. Secondly, the breathing system is at risk because there can be constantly stuff going into the lungs. So, it's really important to keep them healthy. So, we started thinking about this. We knew that we had strength in wearables, and this idea around a breathing technology started. And it was like, yeah, let's go for this. Now, as we looked at it, what we realized was that the market for breath work is actually exponentially larger than where we started. So, I think what's exciting about this is that the benefits of breath work, like actually we all breathe every day, but we don't
Mhm.
necessarily breathe in a way that can help improve our health. We
Mhm.
kind of just breathe to get by, if you know what I mean. So it's kind of like walking,
Uh-huh.
unless we're told we should do more of it, we just walk to get by. So I'd say it's the same thing with breathing. Certain Eastern cultures have known this for thousands and thousands of years, and they've brought this into their cultures. And in the West, we've only recently started to really embrace this. And I think part of embracing it is some of the great research that has come out about the
Mhm.
benefits of breath work. So it can improve your blood pressure. It decreases anxiety. Like it's just like there are all these really fantastic pieces of research that are coming out to support it. We're very excited about that. We see that there is a much larger market in terms of health and wellness. So, physical health and wellness. Athletes totally get why it's necessary to challenge your respiratory system.
Mhm.
The mental health world, the literature and evidence in that world for breath work helping with anxiety is massive. And having said all of this, what we've decided with Breth is that we will be taking a different pathway. We will again be entering into the consumer market with this. And we feel that there's a much larger market, a much less medically based market, so that
Mhm.
the potential to do that is there. We've taken the lessons from mobility and worked it into this product. So again, people don't know what they don't know.
Right.
Again, lot people don't know that they're shallow breathing until something shows them that, hey, actually you're breathing fairly rapidly and fairly in a fairly shallow manner. And
Yeah.
it gives you insight into what your body's doing. The same thing with breath. So it has respiratory sensors, gives you insight into what your body's doing. So it's that biofeedback. And the second part that we brought into it is this whole thing around adherence. So, once again, these are exercises that need to be done on a regular basis to feel the full impact of them. So, what's going to get you to do this? How are you going to stick to them? I can say that. So, in the product, when it takes you through the breathwork exercises, there's three modes of input that you get as a user. You get audio, visual, and this haptic. Um,
Okay.
vibrotactile sensation on the chest. And so there is something about that for me that is like it's incredibly calming. When I look at I wear Whoop, and I monitor my physiological measurements that way. And in just 3 to 5 minutes of breath work, I can take my heart rate from 90 down to 50. And
Wow.
yeah, it's pretty amazing to see that kind of stuff. So, there is for me, that becomes very motivating, and it feels good, like, it feels really great, that haptic input feels amazing, and it's hard to describe. When I was talking with someone else who tried this in, the launch event that we had in the city here, they said something to me. They said, "It's kinda like trying to describe what sugar tastes like to someone."
Mhm.
Hard to describe how for me, the haptic input is totally it's like a focus center for me and almost like a vortex. So, for people I think who have trouble finding calm in meditation, even though they try really hard, but their mind's still racing, there's something about the centering ability of this haptic input for me, anyway.
Mhm.
It'll be really interesting to hear from our users that are out there.
Yeah. And so I think, I believe currently there's a waiting list to be able to get our hands on this device. Is that right?
Yeah, so we're pre-selling right now.
Okay.
What our expected delivery is in November. So we're really excited about that in terms of getting the product out. We have beta testers who are just getting their products delivered over the next week or two.
That's super exciting. Good luck with that. I've got one last question for you to kind of bring this whole thing together. Because I know I mentioned to you about, your journey with a clinician and then being a researcher and all those things culminating now with True Angle. I want to ask, one thing that you mentioned was like one of the things that the initial grant was they don't want you to develop a technology that just goes and sits on a shelf, which I can imagine is quite common in academia. What are some things you think can change? What can we do maybe as a society or as an industry in order to have more of those research discoveries make it to the market as opposed to just sitting on a shelf?
Yeah, I think, one of the main things that is really important is for universities to understand that there needs to be this nurturing of academics who potentially want to do this. Some never will, but definitely there are ones who want to. And yet it's kind of that thing of not knowing what to do next. And I think what I'm seeing in some of our academic institutions around the world is that they're coming to understand this. They're definitely working into there's accelerators that certain universities have their own like early development accelerators. So they kind of they're doing what I had said I wish we had done earlier, which was kind of get that business focus in much earlier into the research to wrap your
Mhm.
head around things you need to be thinking of. So think just nurturing that connection with researchers a little bit more, but also understanding like, are you working with a researcher who really has a drive to do this? Or are they always going to want to stay in their lab? And there's nothing wrong with either way, but
Mhm.
if they do wanna stay in their lab, how can you help them then? Like, can you put in an executive in residence to work with them to help move this along so it doesn't sit on a shelf?
Yeah. I think those are great insights. I think I actually saw something that my alma mater, Illinois Tech here, announced where they're doing something similar to promote that, which is why I was super curious to just hear your take on where the direction is headed. Well, I think we'll wrap it there. Thank you so much for taking the time powering through some of these technical difficulties we've been having. And yeah, I'll put the links in the show notes. Well, all the best with Brett. I hope the product launch goes well, and I know you guys are going to iterate on the feedback, whether it's good or bad. And so I think it's a super exciting time for you. So all the best. Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the episode. Would love to know what you think about Jana's story, whether something that she said resonated with you, whether you have any comments or feedback, or if there's any other kind of stories that you want to see me share on this podcast. So don't hesitate. Drop me a comment, drop me an email. Would love to hear from you. All right. See you next week.